The entire Foundation was in turmoil. Researchers were getting into heated fistfights with security officers, who in turn were retaliating in fits of unbridled animalistic rage. The facility had erupted into such a frenzy, with chairs being hurled across testing chambers and armories raided for weapons, to escalate the brawl into a far deadlier incident. Tables were overturned and used as cover as the Foundation's own staff turned on each other. And before long, an all-out war had erupted. But this wasn't a battle of one side versus another. No, this was a wild and rampant free-for-all. Everyone was out to get everyone else, viewing their own colleagues as mortal enemies. And it was all thanks to Junior, the spawn of the Shy Guy. Only a month before, the Foundation had been subject to another bout of chaos, although this one was much more subdued than the explosive battle that would later sweep the facility. Everyone was abuzz. Researchers ignored their work, and some security personnel even abandoned their posts to see what all the fuss was about. Something was very wrong with SCP-096. The creature was normally docile unless directly observed. It spent the majority of its time just pacing around in its containment chamber or staying hunched over in a fetal position, crying to itself. In fact, it was so often sobbing quietly and making all manner of discontented noises that this became known as its usual behavior. At first, almost nobody had noticed that something was even amiss. All seemed right with the miserable monster, that is, until the screaming started. It was a loud, shrieking sound that pierced the eardrums of whoever heard it, then proceeded to climb down their spine and bring a chill to their bones, making their blood run icy cold and causing their skin to be littered with goosebumps. The screeching, disturbing noise flooded out of SCP-096's cell, reverberating off of every wall and echoing down every corridor until not one member of Foundation personnel could ignore it. It was unlike anything they'd ever heard from the creature before. This primal howling seemed to put everyone who heard it on edge, not just because it was unfamiliar, but because everyone uncannily seemed to know what the screams were indicating: pain. Perhaps even the worst physical pain that SCP-096 had ever felt. What if the Shy Guy was dying? Something had to be done. But therein lay a hurdle to clear first. How could the Foundation help, even offer medical assistance if needed, to a creature they couldn't even safely look at? What options are there for even getting somebody close enough to examine the Shy Guy without it killing them? They were limited. But a crowd of the SCP Foundation's best and brightest researchers had already congregated outside the containment chamber housing 096 after they heard its screams. Surely between them, they could come up with an idea. Hearing the Shy Guy continuing to howl in agony, one researcher came forward and made a suggestion. There was a device another Foundation researcher had developed, codenamed Scramble. Resembling standard-issue night vision goggles, one Dr. Dan had created these Scramble goggles to identify 096's face and digitally alter it so that the wearer was unable to see its face. Essentially, it edited out the Shy Guy's face in real time so that its homicidal rage state couldn't be activated. The use of Dr. Dan's Scramble goggles had previously led to a catastrophic incident that claimed the lives of Mobile Task Force Tau-1, also known as Big Brother. The Scramble devices allowed the wearer's brain to receive a single nanosecond of SCP-096 unscrambled before the image was altered by the goggles. So, needless to say, since time was running out to help the creature and there were no other viable options for doing so, the Scramble goggles would need some serious refinement, and fast. Working as quickly as they could, the gathered gaggle of researchers requisitioned an old pair of scrambled goggles and started trying to improve them. Tinkering equipment specialists put their heads together with computer science engineers as they coded like crazy, all underscored by the continued screams of SCP-096. Then, without warning or even a hint of what had happened inside the cell, the screaming suddenly stopped. Everyone outside the containment chamber stopped for a second, falling deathly silent. The goggles were almost ready, but were they too late to save the Shy Guy? The security personnel who had also gathered in response to the sound all drew straws, with the officer pulling the shortest being the one tasked with venturing into the containment chamber. He was handed the goggles and instructed that they would blur his version entirely for a few seconds while the Scramble software had a chance to work. Then, once the device had double, triple, and quadruple checked the results, the goggles would activate fully, and in theory, worked the way Dr. Dan had originally intended. Although the track record of the Scramble project meant that the officer was hardly reassured as he entered the dark, dingy containment chamber. He couldn't see a thing ahead of him, his vision totally obscured as the goggles started running the newly updated version of the Scramble software. They were untested, so naturally, the security officer's nerves were at peak levels, worried the device might fail, and any second, his eyes would be greeted by the face of SCP-096. He could tell the creature was still alive. There was a low sound of panting breaths coming from the far corner of the chamber, indicating that it hadn't perished, although it might have been injured. A sudden beep from the Scramble goggles startled the officer. The device had made its checks and was ready to activate. However, an unexpected message blinked on the heads-up display that read,
"Warning, multiple subjects detected."
Luckily enough, when the goggles activated, the officer was relieved to see they had worked. SCP-096's face was a grainy, pixelated mess. The creature showed little noticeable sign of any injuries too, and just seemed to be gently rocking itself in the corner. But quickly, the reason and perhaps even the cause of SCP-096's earlier screams soon became obvious. Though nobody had entered the containment cell before the security officer, it seemed the shy guy wasn't alone. Standing at about a third of SCP-096's considerable height was another shy guy. Or at least another version of a creature almost identical save for being shorter. It wobbled on its elongated legs, like it wasn't quite used to standing upright. It kept both arms outstretched towards SCP-096, almost as though it was reaching out for a hug, but the shy guy stayed in the corner, cowering away from the other creature. Through his Scramble goggles, the security officer looked on in disbelief at the scene before him. Somehow, completely unpredictably, SCP-096 had spawned an offspring. It had had a baby. There was a general air of disbelief among the assembled staff outside the containment chamber after the security officer had relayed what had happened. Most were quick to write it off as an impossibility. They'd studied SCP-096 for a long time, and it had been the only anomaly known to the Foundation matching its own very particular description. There had been no others sighted in the wild. It didn't seem to be part of a species, as far as anyone knew. But other researchers refuted this claim, given SCP-096's ability to travel at anomalous speeds and kill those that looked at it. It stood to reason there could be others. Maybe the Foundation wasn't aware of a whole species of shy guys, because anyone who'd ever seen one didn't live long enough to report it. Then someone mentioned that it wasn't entirely unprecedented for anomalies to have offspring either. A long while before, SCP-049, the infamous beak-masked plague doctor, had laid an egg which had hatched into SCP-049-J, a smaller version of himself composed of moss and wads of tissue. Trying to apply logical understanding to each and every anomaly was a paradoxical exercise in futility. All anomalies had their own rules, even rules the Foundation had never observed before. After a great deal of deliberation and additional improvements of the Scramble technology, a research team was sent into the containment chamber to retrieve SCP-096's progeny. The parent creature was still shying away from its creation, perhaps because it didn't want to raise it in the way that meant the child inherited its deadly sense of self-consciousness. Then again, maybe the shy guy was just afraid of what it had unleashed on an unsuspecting Foundation. Initial testing with the offspring creature revealed it was perfectly healthy and seemingly very much unlike its predecessor. Until any official SCP Foundation designation number could be assigned, the team examining it took to calling it SCP-096 Junior, or shortened to simply Junior. Junior regarded the Foundation scientists with curiosity, intrigued by them as well as their surroundings, picking up medical instruments before very carefully placing them back where it found them, treating every item it touched like they had been made of the finest, most delicate glass. One of the researchers likened its movements to that of a lemur or other similar primates, but with the reserved, timid, and docile nature of a well-domesticated pet. That was, at first. Naturally, the SCP Foundation being the organization that it is, there quickly became an interest in whether Junior displayed the same anomalous traits as SCP-096. Call it curiosity or caution. They wanted to know if it would react the same way when observed without the protection of Scramble goggles. So a test was devised, seating a member of D-Class personnel in the same room as Junior, and tasked only with looking at the Shy Guy's spawn. Everyone gathered with bated breath, the research team watching from an observation desk, all of them wearing scramble goggles to blur Junior's face. As a blindfolded D-Class was brought in and stood opposite of Junior, all of them expected that the test would unfold in a particular way, which made it all the more surprising when, as the D-Class's blindfold was removed, nothing happened. Junior regarded the convict with the same general curiosity as it had for everyone else, but beyond that, showed no change in behavior, no wild crying, no murderous rage state, nothing. "Are we sure this is actually the Shy Guy's kid?" one of the researchers joked. With the test concluded and then repeated a few extra times for good measure, Junior was deemed a safe class anomaly. Much like SCP-099 or Josie the Half-Cat, it was decided that Junior be allowed to wander freely around the facility. While initially a little unnerving to some staff when they first saw him without goggles, people quickly warmed to Junior. He was like a small monkey from a safari park, although with the added benefit of not stealing anyone's iPhone or wallet. But at least, until shortly after. Around nearly a month had passed since Junior's birth, and since then an odd change had been noted in SCP-096. The Shy Guy seemed calmer, more at ease, and far less anxious. What's more, researchers discovered that for the first time ever, he could be observed. However, before they could investigate further, all hell broke loose. It started in the holding cells where D-Classes were housed, initially written off as fights between inmates that got a little too out of hand. But soon the Foundation's own personnel started to violently attack each other. It was sparked at random, a state of animalistic rage that was focused on their fellow staff members, the people they worked with, the people who saw them every day, and it didn't stop. Those working at the facility were seemingly possessed by an inescapable urge to harm those around them, as if punishing each other for just looking at them. By the time a mobile task force was ordered to step in and defuse the situation, the scene they arrived to was one of utter chaos. Further examination uncovered that those who had seen Junior's face had been exposed to an anomalous effect. Looking at the creature gave the observer the same rageful reaction to being observed as SCP-096. They were compelled to kill anyone who saw them. However, most insidiously, this didn't seem to take effect instantly. In fact, those affected only entered their collective rage state after everyone in the facility had interacted with Junior at least once, almost like it had been waiting to infect everyone. While the remainder of the Foundation mopped up the aftermath of the incident, some theorized that SCP-096 had somehow expelled all its self-consciousness, all of its negative traits into its progeny. This was supposedly why the Shy Guy seemed so much calmer, so much so that it could even be observed. Whether Junior simply couldn't contain all SCP-096's negativity, or intentionally spread it to everyone else around it, it is unknown. The only solution to get things back to normal was to put the Shy Guy's self-consciousness back to where it came from. Now go check out SCP-096 vs. SCP-343 and SCP-096 vs. SCP-106 for more.